In 1982, the Electronic Instrument Company mailed its final catalog. It was printed on newsprint, the kind of paper that comes apart in your hands if it gets wet, the kind used for grocery store circulars and penny saver flyers. On the cover, 3 models of multimeter, an address in Long Island City, a phone number for orders. No amplifiers, no tuners, no kits, no tubes. 37 years after Harry Ashley had walked into a storefront at 84 Wither Street in Brooklyn with $1,500 in his pocket and an idea about what Americans wanted to do with their evenings, this was what remained. 1 page, newsprint, 3 multimeters. And yet, in 1956, 26 years before that final catalog, EICO had shipped its 1 millionth instrument in living rooms from Flatbush to Fresno, from South Boston to San Diego. Americans were sitting in the dark in front of amplifiers they had built themselves, 12 tubes glowing amber behind the ventilation slots. A Frank Sinatra record turning on a Garrard turntable. The sound of something handmade filling a room that had never heard anything quite like it. The catalog that year was 40 pages, printed on stock heavy enough to last, full of products, full of possibility. Those 2 catalogs, the one from 1956 and the one from 1982, are the same company, the same Brooklyn address, the same founder, the same name stamped on the cover. What happened between them is not simply the story of a business that failed. It is the story of a specific American proposition that a working man could build with his own hands on a kitchen table, a piece of equipment that competed with the best manufactured goods of his era. That proposition required the specific set of conditions. And when those conditions disappeared, one by one, through the decade nobody saw coming, they took EICO with them. But what does it mean when the only thing left of an empire is a parts list printed on newspaper? And the things that empire made are still in American living rooms, still playing, still warm. If stories like this one matter to you, American companies, American craftsmen, American sound, subscribe to Forgotten Instruments. There are more of these stories than anyone has counted. We are counting them. Now, Brooklyn, 1945. The war had been over for less than a year. The men coming back from the Pacific and from Europe were not the same men who had left. Many of them had spent 3 or 4 years inside the electronic infrastructure of the United States military, wiring radio sets on destroyers, calibrating radar equipment on airfields, troubleshooting communications gear in conditions that did not forgive mistakes. They had learned something that no civilian schoolroom had yet figured out how to teach at scale. They had learned that electronics was not magic, it was craft. It was patient work with specific tools toward a specific result. And they had learned it the same way a cabinet maker learns joinery or a machinist learns tolerances, by doing it repeatedly, under pressure, until it became second nature. Harry R. Ashley was one of those men. He had run a radio repair business before the war. He understood the trade from the bench up, not from a textbook, not from a corporate training program, but from the specific and unglamorous work of diagnosing failed circuits and making them right again. When he came back to Brooklyn in 1945, he looked at the landscape of his industry and saw something that has always been the starting point for a certain kind of American business. A gap between what people needed and what they could afford to buy. The gap was this: a trained electronics technician, a returning veteran, a radio hobbyist, a young engineer just starting out, needed test equipment to do his work, an oscilloscope to visualize electrical waveforms, a vacuum tube voltmeter to measure signal levels without loading the circuit, a signal tracer to chase faults through an audio chain. This equipment existed. It was available from industrial suppliers and established manufacturers, and it was priced for laboratories and professional service shops, not for the man working out of a spare bedroom in Flatbush or a garage in Flushing. Ashley did not invent the solution. He recognized it. If you gave a trained man the components, the chassis, the hardware, and a clear set of instructions, he could build the equipment himself. And if you sold him a kit instead of a finished instrument, you could remove the cost of factory assembly entirely. The customer's labor replaced the factory's labor. The customer got professional-grade equipment at a fraction of the assembled price. Ashley got a business. He started with $1,500. The address was 84 Withers Street, Williamsburg, a working Brooklyn neighborhood of machinists and garment workers and radio repairmen, where the buildings were brick and the storefronts were small, and the men who worked in them knew the difference between something built right and something built fast. It was not a glamorous starting point. It was an honest one. His first product appeared in the July 1946 issue of Radio News magazine. The Model 113, he called it the electron tracer, was a combination vacuum tube voltmeter and audio signal tracer. A vacuum tube voltmeter, a meter that uses a vacuum tube's high input impedance to measure voltage in a circuit without drawing enough current to disturb the measurement. The difference between taking a patient's temperature and changing it. An audio signal tracer, a device that lets a technician inject a test signal into a circuit and follow it stage by stage until the point where it disappears, identifying the failed component by the silence it leaves behind. The electron tracer was priced at $89.50 assembled. It was not yet a kit. Ashley was still learning what his market wanted. He learned quickly. In August 1948, EICO ran its first kit advertisement in radio and television news. The product was the Model 221K, a vacuum tube voltmeter in kit form, priced at $33. The advertisement carried a line that had appeared, almost identically, in a Heathkit advertisement 2 months earlier, in June of the same year. It read, "Nothing else to buy." 3 words that summarized an entire business proposition. Everything a man needed to build a working professional instrument. Signed your fee thing on worchix, diggy is courses so worth. Every component, every fastener, every length of wire was in the box. No trip to the parts counter, no supplementary order from a catalog. Open the box, follow the instructions, build the thing. The price dropped within months to $23.95. At that price, the kit cost less than a week's groceries for a family of 4 in Brooklyn in 1948. A comparable assembled instrument from an industrial supplier cost 3 to 4 times as much. The economics were not subtle. By the early 1950s, to the 1950s, EICO had moved from Williamsburg to a larger facility at 3320 Northern Boulevard in Long Island City, across the East River from Manhattan, in the same industrial corridor that housed printing plants, auto parts distributors, and light manufacturing operations of every description. The company was growing. The catalog was expanding. And Harry Ashley had identified a second market, larger and more emotionally charged than the test equipment business, that EICO was uniquely positioned to serve. That market was high-fidelity audio. In 1948, Columbia Records had introduced the long-playing record, the LP, and with it, the possibility of listening to music at home in a way that had not previously existed. A symphony could now fit on a single disc. A jazz session could unspool for 20 minutes without interruption. The fidelity of the recording, properly played back, could fill a living room with something that sounded, if the equipment was right, like the actual event. American consumers heard this possibility and wanted it. The audiophile press, High Fidelity magazine, launched in 1951, followed by Stereo Review and Audio, told them in careful technical detail what equipment they needed to achieve it. The equipment the magazines described was expensive. A Fisher 500 stereo receiver. Series, assembled, warranted, bearing the name of one of America's most respected hi-fi brands, cost more than $300. A Macintosh amplifier cost more than $400. For a factory worker in Long Island City earning $85 a week, these were not aspirational purchases. They were impossible ones. EICO looked at that gap, the same way Ashley had looked at the test equipment gap in 1945. The components were available. The instructions could be written. The customer's labor could replace the factory's labor, and a man who built his own amplifier, who wired every connection himself, who followed the circuit from input to output until he understood it, would hear it differently than a man who unpacked one from a box. What was it that Harry Ashley understood? That the American who built his own amplifier heard it differently than the American who bought one? The answer to that question is what EICO spent the next 15 years proving. The product that proved it arrived around 1960. It was called the HF-81. It sat low to the table, a deliberately minimal chassis, brass faceplate, the kind of industrial restraint that said the money had gone into the circuit, not the cabinet. Through the ventilation slots along the top, you could see them. 12 tubes in their sockets, arranged in 2 rows, the glass envelopes warming from cold gray to amber as the amplifier came to life. It took about 30 seconds. If you had built the thing yourself, if you had placed each of those tubes in its socket with your own hands, had soldered each connection on the point-to-point wiring beneath the chassis, had read out the instruction manual carefully enough to understand why each stage did what it did, those 30 seconds felt different than they would have felt for a man who had simply plugged in a receiver from a store. You were not just turning on an amplifier. You were turning on something you had made. The HF-81 was an integrated amplifier, a preamplifier, and a power amplifier combined on a single chassis. A preamplifier is the stage that receives the low-level signal from a turntable or tuner, amplifies it to a useful level, and applies the tone and source controls a listener uses to shape the sound. A power amplifier takes that shaped signal and drives it to a level capable of moving a speaker cone. Combining both functions in a single box was a practical decision. One power cord, one set of connections, one piece of furniture in the living room, instead of 2. For the American family in 1960, that simplicity was not a compromise. It was a condition of the thing being possible at all. The output tubes were EL-84s, also designated 6BQ5 in American notation, small signal pentodes. Originally developed for European radio and television receivers, adopted by audio designers on both sides of the Atlantic for their particular distortion character. A pentode is a vacuum tube with 5 electrodes. When driven into its nonlinear operating range, when the signal asks more of the tube than the tube can deliver cleanly, it produces harmonic distortion weighted toward the second harmonic, the octave above the fundamental frequency. Human hearing interprets second harmonic distortion not as error, but as warmth, as fullness, as the particular quality that audiophiles in 1960 called presence, and that audiophiles in 2025 still spend considerable money trying to buy. The HF-81 produced 14 watts per channel from those EL-84s. 14 watts is not a large number. Through a properly matched speaker, an Acoustic Research AR2, a KLH Model 6, a Klipschorn in a corner-loaded living room, 14 watts was enough to fill any room in any American house built before 1970. The frequency response ran from 10 Hz to 100 kHz within half a decibel. For reference, human hearing extends from approximately 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz. The HF-81 reproduced the full range of human hearing and then some, at a distortion level that the ear could not distinguish from silence at normal listening volumes. The kit price was $69.95. In 1960, the median American household income was approximately $5,600 per year, roughly $108 per week. The HF-81 kit cost less than 2/3 of 1 week's median wages. A Fisher 500C stereo receiver, factory assembled, fully warranted, carrying one of the most respected names in American hi-fi. Listed at $349.95 at the same moment. A Macintosh MA230 integrated amplifier, the benchmark of American high-end audio. listed at $498. The HF81 kit cost one-fifth of the Macintosh. And the men who had built and heard both, who wrote about it in the letters pages of High Fidelity and Audio magazine, who argued about it on the early internet forums 4 decades later, consistently reported that the HF81, properly assembled and maintained, competed with amplifiers at 3 and 4 times its price, in ways that were not subtle and not imaginary. At $69.95, was the HF81 the most democratic hi-fi amplifier in American history? Or was it something more unsettling? Proof that the best sound in the room did not have to come from the most expensive name on the shelf? The instruction manual was 40 pages. It assumed no prior knowledge of electronics. It told the builder exactly what each component did and why it was placed where it was. It told him what the completed circuit should measure at each test point and what to do if the measurement was wrong. Men who had never held a soldering iron built working HF81s on kitchen tables in a single weekend. Men who had spent their careers in electronics built them in an afternoon and spent the rest of the weekend listening. The distribution was the Allied Radio Catalog, the Lafayette Radio Catalog, direct mail, and the pages of Popular Electronics and Hi-Fi Stereo Review, the print infrastructure of the American hobbyist, reaching subscribers in every state, in cities and in towns, that had no dedicated audio dealer within 100 miles. By 1961, EICO products were available through more than 1,500 dealers and distributors. The HF81 was not a product for New York. It was a product for America. EICO had built something beyond an amplifier. It had built a proposition that the gap between what a working American could afford and what a working American deserved to hear could be closed by his own hands, on his own time, at his own kitchen table. The name on the chassis was not a brand. It was a certificate. In the fall of 1958, Columbia Records shipped the first commercially available stereophonic long-playing records to American retailers. The technology had existed in experimental form for years. Engineers had understood the principle: 2 discrete audio channels, recorded and reproduced simultaneously, creating the spatial illusion of a sound source located between 2 speakers, since the 1930s. But the LP made it practical, made it domestic, made it something a family could do on a Saturday evening in a living room in Levittown, or in a walk-up apartment in Astoria, or in a ranch house outside Columbus, Ohio, if they had the right equipment. The right equipment was the problem. To play a stereo LP correctly, you needed a stereo cartridge in the turntable, a stereo preamplifier with 2 separate channel inputs, and 2 power amplifiers driving 2 speakers placed apart from each other across the room. In 1958, that system, assembled from brand-name components purchased new, fully warranted, cost the equivalent of 2 months' wages for a factory worker. For most American families, it was not a purchase. It was a category of purchase that did not apply to them. EICO changed the arithmetic. A complete EICO stereo system in 1960. The HF81 integrated amplifier in kit form, a stereo FM tuner kit, a stereo cartridge from Shure, a pair of speaker kits from one of several American suppliers, could be assembled for under $200, including the cost of the components not included in the kits. $200 was still serious money in 1960. It was not 2 months' wages. It was 3 weeks. And it produced a system that the audiophile press, the reviewers at High Fidelity, the correspondents at Audio magazine, the letters page writers who documented their listening experiences in careful and sometimes obsessive detail, consistently described as performing beyond its price point by a margin that the premium brands did not like to acknowledge. The Americans who built these systems were a specific type. They subscribed to popular electronics and electronics world. They belonged to local radio clubs and hi-fi societies that met in church basements and school cafeterias. They read the EICO instruction manuals the way other men read technical manuals for their cars, not because they had to, but because understanding the thing was part of owning it. They were veterans who had wired radio equipment on destroyers in the Pacific. They were high school shop teachers who brought kit projects into the classroom. They were young engineers at RCA and Bell Labs and Grumman who built their own audio equipment at home because the act of building it was inseparable from the pleasure of understanding it. The geographic spread was national and genuinely democratic. EICO kits shipped through Allied Radio's Chicago catalog to addresses in Iowa and Montana. They shipped through Lafayette Radio's Long Island City warehouse to apartment buildings in the Bronx and row houses in South Philadelphia. They shipped direct, by mail, to rural addresses in states that had no electronics dealer within 50 miles. The community of EICO builders was not concentrated in any one city or any one demographic. It was seemed dispersed across the country, connected not by geography, but by the shared experience of a specific kind of Saturday afternoon out. The kit box open on the table, the instruction manual propped against the sugar bowl, the soldering iron heating up on its stand. At its peak in the early 1960s, EICO offered a complete hi-fi product line: the HF81 integrated stereo amplifier, the HF50 and HF35 monoblock power amplifiers, for those who wanted separate channels and separate chassis, the ST40 and ST70 stereo integrated amplifiers at higher power outputs, the HFT90 FM monotuner, the MX99 stereo multiplex adapter that converted a monotuner to stereo reception. Every component a serious American listener needed, available in kit form or fully assembled, at prices that made the proposition accessible to anyone who was willing to spend the time. The time was the point. The time was never a cost. The time was the product. In 1961, Harry Ashley took EICO public. The SEC registration filed that year listed 173,000 capital stock shares for public sale, underwritten by Goodbody and Company, a respected New York brokerage house that did not underwrite companies it did not believe in. After the sale of his 57,000 shares, Ashley retained approximately 71% of the total outstanding shares of the company. He had not sold the company. He had capitalized it. There is a difference, and Ashley understood it. The IPO was not an exit. It was a declaration. EICO was large enough, stable enough, and sufficiently profitable to attract Wall Street's attention, and Ashley intended to keep building. The catalog that year reflected that confidence. 40 pages, printed on heavy stock. The hi-fi section ran to 12 pages, with detailed specifications for every product, photographs of completed kits in furnished living rooms, and testimonial copy drawn from letters that customers had actually written. The language in those letters was consistent across hundreds of them, across dozens of issues of the hobbyist press in which EICO customers documented their experiences. The word that appeared most often was not affordable. It was not good value. The word that appeared most often was surprised. Men who had built the HF81 on a kitchen table and then sat down to listen to it were surprised, genuinely, sometimes almost indignantly surprised, by what they had made. That surprise was EICO's most powerful marketing instrument. It cost nothing to manufacture. It could not be counterfeited by a competitor. It was the direct and unrepeatable product of the specific experience of building the thing yourself and then hearing what it did. No advertisement could produce it. No salesman could sell it. It arrived only at the moment a man placed a record on the turntable, set the needle in the groove, and heard music come out of 12 tubes he had placed in their sockets with his own hands. Consider the specific stakes of that moment. A middle-class American family in 1961. A living room in a post-war house, the kind built by Levitt or Kaiser, efficient and modest, and furnished with the careful attention of people who had grown up without much. A turntable, a new stereo LP, Frank Sinatra's In the Wee Small Hours, or Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, or the first stereo pressing of a Beethoven symphony that the local record shop had just received, and an HF-81, assembled over 3 weekends on the kitchen table, now sitting on the shelf it would occupy for the next 20 years. The music that came out of that amplifier on that first evening was not different from the music on the record, but the experience of it was. It was warmer. It was more present. It had a quality that the audiophile press called involvement, and that ordinary listeners described more simply. It sounded like the real thing. Not because the HF-81 was the finest amplifier ever made, but because the man listening to it had made it. He heard it through everything he knew about it. Every solder joint, every component, every stage of the circuit he had traced from input to output in the instruction manual. The music and the making of the thing that played it were inseparable. No other audio company in American history had put that specific combination, that precise intersection of pride and sound, in the same room. By January 1970, EICO's advertisement in Popular Electronics carried a milestone: over 3 million EICO instruments now in use. 3 million. The number looked triumphant on the page. It was printed in bold type, set above a photograph of the current product line, surrounded by the confident graphic language of American industrial advertising at its post-war peak. But the number told a more complicated story to anyone who was paying attention. The first million had arrived by December 1956, 11 years after Ashley opened the doors at 84 Withers Street. The second million had come sometime in the early 1960s, during the hi-fi boom, when the catalog was fat and the orders were steady. The third million, the one celebrated in that January 1970 advertisement, had taken the better part of a decade to accumulate. The curve that had risen sharply through the 1950s had flattened through the 1960s and was now barely rising at all. 3 million was not a beginning. It was a summit. And on the other side of every summit, the ground goes somewhere. The thing about structural collapse is that it rarely announces itself. It does not arrive as a single decision, a single competitor, a single bad year. It arrives as a convergence. Several forces moving independently toward the same point, each one manageable in isolation, none of them manageable together. EICO did not fail because one thing went wrong. EICO failed because 3 things went wrong simultaneously, in sequence. In a decade that had no mercy for companies whose business model depended on conditions that were quietly disappearing. The first force was the Japanese integrated receiver. By the early 1970s, Pioneer, Kenwood, and Sansui had each introduced lines of solid-state stereo receivers, AM/FM tuner, preamplifier, and power amplifier, combined in a single factory-assembled chassis that were available through American retailers at prices that had no precedent in the domestic market. The Pioneer SX434, introduced in the early 1970s, delivered 15 watts per channel from a fully assembled, fully warranted receiver that a consumer could carry out of a store and plug into the wall within the hour. Its American retail price was in the range of $130. A comparable EICO kit, components, chassis, hardware, cost more than that before the builder had invested a single hour of his time. This was the moment the economics of assembly stopped making sense. The argument for building your own equipment had always rested on a specific calculation. The cost of the kit plus your time was less than the cost of the assembled equivalent, and the assembled equivalent was inferior to what you could build. By 1972, that calculation had inverted on both sides simultaneously. The assembled equivalent, the Japanese receiver, was cheaper than the kit, and it was not inferior. It was, by most objective measures of power output, distortion, and reliability, at least the equal of what a careful builder could produce at home. The gap that EICO had existed to close had been closed by the Japanese electronics industry from the other direction. EICO's response was the Cortina. Beginning in 1966 and running through the early 1970s, EICO introduced a line of solid-state amplifiers and receivers under the Cortina name, a word chosen presumably for its European connotations of modernity and style. Though it carried no weight in the American audio market and bore no relationship to anything EICO had built before, the Cortina line was EICO's attempt to compete directly with Pioneer and Kenwood on their own terms. Factory-assembled solid-state electronics at consumer prices, sold through the same channels that had carried the tube kits. It did not work. The Cortina amplifiers were not poorly designed. Engineers who have restored them in the decades since describe them as competent, workmanlike, solid-state circuits that perform reasonably well when properly serviced. But competent and workmanlike was not enough in a market where Pioneer and Kenwood were offering genuine engineering excellence at aggressive prices, backed by dealer service networks that EICO could not match. The catalog evidence is unambiguous. In 1966 and 1967, Cortina occupied the cover and the first several pages of the EICO catalog. By 1969 and 1970, it had retreated to secondary placement behind test equipment. By 1972 and 1973, it occupied 2 pages of a 32-page catalog. By 1973, those 2 pages had the visual language of a clearance section. The inventory was moving out. Nothing was coming in to replace it. 8. EICO had tried to become something it was not, in a market controlled by companies that had spent decades becoming exactly that thing. The attempt cost the company its catalog credibility in hi-fi, without establishing a new identity in solid-state electronics. The community of builders who had trusted EICO, who had assembled its tube amplifiers and written enthusiastic letters to the hobbyist press about the results, looked at the Cortina line and saw a company that had stopped speaking their language. They did not write letters about the Cortina. They did not recommend it to their friends at the electronics club. They bought Pioneer receivers instead, and they did not feel guilty about it. The tube kit business, meanwhile, was not recovering. It was not even holding steady. It was contracting in ways that no product decision EICO could have made would have reversed, because the contraction was not coming from inside the company. It was coming from outside the entire industry. The hobbyist electronics ecosystem that had made EICO possible was not a single thing. It was a web of interdependent institutions, magazines, parts dealers, retail chains, radio clubs, vocational programs, and a specific cultural attitude toward leisure time and technical self-improvement that had grown up together in the post-war years and that by the mid-1970s was coming apart at every joint simultaneously. Consider what a man needed in 1955 to build an EICO kit successfully. He needed the kit itself. He needed a soldering iron, solder, a few hand tools. He needed a place to buy replacement components if something arrived damaged or proved defective. A local electronics parts counter or a catalog from Allied Radio or Lafayette Radio, from which he could order a replacement capacitor or a substitute tube within a week. He needed a magazine that reviewed the product honestly and answered technical questions in its letters column. He needed, in some cases, another man who had built the same kit and could help him trace a fault in the completed circuit. Every one of these requirements had been reliably met in 1955. By 1975, each of them was under pressure. Lafayette Radio Electronics, the Queens-based retailer and mail-order catalog house that had been one of EICO's primary market interfaces to the American hobbyist since the late 1940s, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1981. Lafayette had been selling EICO kits through its catalog and its retail stores for more than 3 decades. It had been the place a man in Jamaica, Queens, could walk in on a Saturday morning and pick up a replacement EL84 tube, or a specific value of filter capacitor, or the instruction manual for an EICO kit he had found at a garage sale and wanted to restore. When Lafayette closed, it did not simply close a store. It closed a piece of the infrastructure that had made kit building rational and accessible for an entire generation of American hobbyists. The magazines were thinning. Popular Electronics, which had carried EICO advertisements and covered kit building as a serious pursuit since the early 1950s, was shifting its coverage toward personal computers and consumer electronics. The readers who had subscribed for the Tube Amplifier articles were aging. The younger readers coming in wanted to know about microprocessors, not output transformers. The editorial coverage followed of the readers, as it always does, and the readers were following the in the personal computer. The same technically curious Americans who had spent their evenings in 1958 building EICO amplifiers were spending their evenings in 1978 building or programming personal computers, the TRS-80, the Apple II, the MITS Altair, the Heathkit H11. The cognitive energy was identical. The sense of productive engagement, of making something work through patient application of technical knowledge was the same. But the personal computer offered something the hi-fi kit had never offered, a payoff that expanded over time. A completed amplifier did one thing, and it did it well, and it did not do anything more next month than it did the day it was finished. A personal computer was different every week. The horizon kept moving. For a technically curious American in 1978, the horizon mattered. Heathkit, EICO's oldest and largest competitor, the Benton Harbor, Michigan company that had defined the American kit electronics industry for 3 decades, recognized this shift and pivoted toward personal computers with its H89 and H11 lines. The pivot bought Heathkit several additional years. It did not save the kit business in the end, but it demonstrated that a company with sufficient resources and institutional flexibility could at least follow the market as it moved. EICO did not follow. By the mid-1970s, the only audio products EICO sold were kits manufactured for them in South Korea. The American hands that had once built the components that went into the kits, the craftsmen who wound transformers and stamped chassis in the New York metropolitan area's light manufacturing corridor, were no longer part of the product. The kits still arrived in boxes. The instruction manuals were still included. But the thing that had justified the exercise, the sense that an American was building something genuinely American, from components made with American precision to a standard defined by American engineering, had been quietly removed from the proposition without announcement. The 1982 catalog arrived in mailboxes that year printed on newsprint. Multimeters on the cover. No amplifiers, no tubes, no kits. The Long Island City address was still there. The phone number for orders was still there. The company was still, technically, in business. But the business EICO had been the business Harry Ashley had built from $1,500 and a Brooklyn storefront in 1945 was finished. The last EL84 tube had been installed in the last EICO amplifier years before. No ceremony, no press release, no final run of 100 units with a commemorative badge on the faceplate. The line simply stopped. The way a conversation stops when there is nothing left to say. The tooling was not preserved. The trained assemblers went elsewhere. The catalog went to newsprint, and then the catalog stopped too. EICO did not become a zombie brand. There was no private equity firm that acquired the name and attached it to amplifiers built in Shenzhen. There was no licensing arrangement with a Vietnamese or Indonesian manufacturer producing receivers that carried the EICO badge but shared nothing else with the instruments Harry Ashley had designed in Brooklyn. The name did not resurface on a crowdfunding campaign 40 years later, promising to honor the legacy while manufacturing in a country Ashley had never visited. None of that happened. What happened was quieter and, in its own way, more honest. At some point in the late 1970s, after the Cortina line had failed, and after the South Korean source kits had run their course, EICO exited the electronics business entirely and became a commercial real estate company, the same corporate entity that had filed SEC registration papers in 1961 to sell amplifier kits was now selling and mortgaging commercial properties in the New York metropolitan area. On May 28, 1999, the shareholders of the Electronic Instrument Company voted to approve a plan of liquidation. The process was expected to be complete by December 31, 2002. There was no announcement in the audio press. There was no obituary in Popular Electronics, which had itself ceased publication in 1999 after 54 years. Two American institutions, born in the same post-war moment, dissolved in the same calendar year without anyone holding a funeral for either of them. The silence was complete, and the silence was accurate. What the silence could not touch was the amplifiers. In June of 2025, a fully rebuilt EICO HF81 integrated tube amplifier was listed for sale by Sky-Fi Audio at $2,990. The original kit price in 1960 had been $69.95. The ratio, 43 times the original price, 6 decades later, is not a curiosity. It is a verdict. The market for restored vintage American tube amplifiers has rendered a judgment that no corporate decision, no catalog reduction, no pivot to real estate could reverse. The thing EICO made was worth more than EICO knew. On Reverb.com and eBay, completed listings for EICO HF81 units in original or restored condition regularly close between $800 and $3,000 depending on condition and the quality of restoration work. On the Audio Asylum forums, the online community that inherited the intellectual culture of the hobbyist electronics press, the EICO group that formed in the early years of the Internet maintained active discussion threads about capacitor replacement specifications, optimal tube substitutions, and the relative merits of different restoration approaches for the HF81 chassis. These are not nostalgic conversations, they are technical conversations conducted by people who use these amplifiers as their primary listening equipment in 2005, and who care about getting the restoration right because the stakes are audible. A properly restored HF81 with equivalent or original EL84 output tubes, reformed filter capacitors, and the point-to-point wiring undisturbed, produces a second harmonic distortion character at moderate listening levels that no solid-state amplifier has replicated in the same way. The Stereophile review published in July 2006 described it as capable of embarrassing solid-state amplifiers at several times its restored price. Session players in Nashville and Los Angeles do not rent HF81s for recording sessions. EICO was never a professional studio brand, and nothing in the historical record suggests otherwise. But the audiophiles who discovered these amplifiers in the late 1990s and early 2000s, through the early internet forums and the emerging vintage audio market, have paid multiples of new production prices to own and maintain them. The collector market does not lie about these things. It cannot afford to. The physical addresses tell their own story. 84 Withers Street in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, where Harry Ashley opened his first storefront in 1945 with $1,500, is now in one of the most expensive residential neighborhoods in New York City. The building that may have housed his radio repair shop is surrounded by converted loft apartments, artisanal coffee shops, and creative agency offices. A one-bedroom apartment within walking distance of that address rents for more per month than EICO's entire founding investment. The neighborhood that produced the company has no memory of it. 3300 Northern Boulevard in Long Island City, where EICO operated at its peak, shipping kits to 1,500 dealers across the country, sits 2 miles from the site that Amazon briefly selected for its second headquarters before withdrawing from the deal in 2019. Long Island City is now a neighborhood of glass residential towers and technology offices. The light manufacturing corridor that once housed EICO and dozens of companies like it is largely gone, replaced by uses that pay more per square foot and employ fewer people per acre. Lafayette Radio Electronics, the Jamaica Queens retailer that had stocked EICO kits and replacement components for more than 3 decades, filed for bankruptcy in 1980 and closed its stores. The building in Jamaica where a man could walk in on a Saturday morning and buy a replacement EL84 tube is occupied by something else now. The tube counter is gone. The catalog is gone. The Saturday morning ritual is gone. Harry R. Ashley, who founded EICO with $1,500 in 1945 and took it public in 1961 and watched it become a real estate company in the 1970s, died in February 1995 at the age of 82. He outlived his electronics business by more than a decade. He did not live to see the internet forums where collectors debate the optimal capacitor replacement strategy for his HF81. He did not see the $2,990 price tags. He saw the newsprint catalog in 1982. He saw the pivot to real estate. He saw the company he had built from a Brooklyn radio repair shop become, in the end, something that managed properties instead of making things. What he thought about that is not recorded. If the amplifiers are still here, and they are, and the sound is still here, and it is, what exactly is gone? What is gone is the proposition. The specific American proposition that a working man could build, with his own hands, on a kitchen table in Brooklyn, or Bakersfield, or Baton Rouge, a piece of equipment that competed with the best manufactured goods of his era. That proposition required an ecosystem, parts dealers, and hobbyist magazines, and radio clubs, and vocational programs, and a cultural consensus that spending your Saturday evening with a soldering iron and an instruction manual was a legitimate and admirable way to spend a Saturday evening. When the ecosystem contracted, when Lafayette filed for bankruptcy and Popular Electronics shifted its coverage and the Japanese receiver made the kit arithmetic irrational, and the personal computer claimed the hours that kit building had once occupied, the proposition contracted with it. Not because it was wrong, because the conditions that made it possible had changed, and the conditions did not come back. The amplifiers survived because amplifiers are stubborn things. Properly built, properly maintained, they do not wear out on any human timescale that matters. The EL84 tubes can be replaced. The capacitors can be reformed or substituted. The point-to-point wiring, laid down by American hands in the early 1960s, does not degrade if it is not disturbed. The output transformers, wound to EICO's specifications in the New York metropolitan area 60 years ago, are still transferring signal from tube to speaker. With the same efficiency they demonstrated the first evening someone powered up the completed kit and put a record on the turntable. Somewhere in Brooklyn tonight, not 3 miles from where Harry Ashley first switched on the lights at 84 Withers Street in 1945. There is an EICO HF81 warming up in an apartment that costs more per month than the entire factory did per year. The tubes are taking their 30 seconds to reach operating temperature. The amber glow is coming up behind the ventilation slots. A record is on the turntable. Something from the years when the kit was new, or something recorded last month that sounds better through old glass than through anything made since. The point-to-point wiring under the chassis is exactly as it was left by the hands that assembled it in a kitchen, in a year when the catalog was 40 pages and printed on heavy stock and full of the specific American confidence that the thing you made yourself was worth making. The company is gone. The real estate it became is gone. The catalog is gone. The storefront on Withers Street is gone. The Lafayette radio store in Jamaica is gone. The light manufacturing corridor in Long Island City is gone. The sound is still here, still warm, still honest, still exactly what it was the first night someone built it. If you found this story worth your time, there are more of them. American companies, American craftsmen, American sound, and the specific and unrepeatable circumstances that made them possible, and the specific and unrepeatable circumstances that ended them. See you in the next one.